Today I want to share with you my genuine excitement that I discovered something new. So first, how did I used to teach the poetry comparison? This is still an excellent method, but I'm going to show you one that's even better. But you need to understand the first one. So I always taught, start with the form and structure of the poem. The reason for that is it's at the top of the mark scheme, and if you get it out of the way first, then you're going to bag those extra marks, and it's also a way to persuade the examiner, look, you are going to read a top grade answer, you know that because I've already dealt with form and structure, which is at the top of the mark scheme. So that's still good advice, but I'm going to change it. Pay attention. The next thing I said was write about the opening of the poem, because this is where the poet is trying to capture our attention. There's bound to be a super cool quote in there, but that quote will also link to the poet's ideas. And again, the poet's ideas are what are at the top of the mark scheme. So if you do those two well, the examiner is already controlled by you and is already thinking, this is going to be a top mark answer. My next two are T, techniques. Now, there's no mystery about the techniques. There aren't particular techniques you need to look for. What you're going to do is pick key images in the poem, and there will be a technique next to them. It might be a simile or a metaphor or alliteration. Don't worry about them. Whatever it is, it's a quote and it will have a technique behind it, and it will be easy for you to see what that technique is. So you're going to write about that technique. You get no marks for naming it unless you link it to the poet's ideas. Remember, poet's ideas, top of the mark scheme. So you've had 3 quotes so far from the opening, 2 techniques that you found as you were thinking about the most impressive images in the poem, and then you're going to pick a quote from the end. Why? Well, again, that is where the poet most shows you their ideas. Whatever was true at the opening has now always, in every single poem you ever read, slightly changed at the end. The poet has positioned you as a reader to have a slightly different perspective, or a dramatically different perspective to what you had at the beginning. And so it's super easy to write about, you've guessed it, the poet's ideas, and get to the top of the mark scheme. Once again, this will be a quote. It will probably have some sort of method that you can write about. If you can't name a method, it doesn't matter. You're going to call it imagery. Imagery always sums up any kind of method that you can ever think of. So if you're stuck, you're going to call it imagery. Right, so that's how I used to teach the poem. The next aspect of my teaching was about the comparison. So for the comparison I said this. Right, you write about the form of one poem, that's what F stands for. So you write about the form of one poem, and then you'd write about the form of the other poem. Then you'd go back to your first poem and you'd write about the opening, and then you'd write about the opening of the second poem. And then you'd go to some sort of imagery that you found in the first poem, and you compare that to some sort of imagery you found in the second poem, and so on. So effectively what you'd have is something about the first poem matched by something about the second, a new point about the first poem matched by something else from the second poem. Well, that is entirely logical, and it's how I've written my exemplar essays in this guide. However, it's also quite challenging, because you have to keep switching your attention from one poem to the other and making sure you compare similar things. Well, if you've been following my videos, you will know that I have been obsessed with actual answers marked by senior examiners, so students actually produce these under exam conditions, and I found something very, very interesting. My method works. I already knew that, but there is a simpler method which works just as well to get the marks, but I think because it is simpler, it allows more students to get those higher marks. This is why I'm so excited. And so here are the 2 key changes. The examiners, although this form and structure is at the top of the mark scheme, they're not particularly fussed about this. And so a simple sentence was going to get the marks. So let's imagine there's no rhyming structure, it's just free verse, and you've got to attach that to the poet's ideas. Well, rather than chuck something artificial in, the free verse will usually link to some sort of freedom that is being sought after in the poem. It could be a freedom of ideas, or a freedom from oppression of some sort of thing, freedom from control that other people are imposing. So free verse easily links to freedom. If there's iambic pentameter or a sonnet or some kind of ballad structure, then the poet is interested in tighter control of some sort. And so you will find easily in your poem some aspect that the poet is trying to emphasise where someone is being controlled. So if you think about Ozymandias or My Last Duchess, it's really obvious that the main characters are thinking about control, and that's why they're in iambic pentameter, that's why one's a sonnet. It's really easy to link. Beyond that, you don't have to go. So it's going to be really easy to get that form and structure mark. The other thing is that when we talk about structure, there's all kinds of other things that naturally lead to structure, like repetition or anaphora or some sort of chorus. And they'll come up naturally in your writing, particularly when you're writing about the ending. So I don't think you need to stress about it at the beginning. So my advice now is don't stress about the form. In fact, I'm giving you, instead of thought, I'm giving you otter. Otter's easier to remember as well, isn't it? Another simplistic thing. What is the R for in otter? It is a reminder. So you're going to say, I'm just going to remind myself, I've got to the end of writing about one poem, have I yet written anything about the form or the structure? If I haven't, I'm going to write that one sentence that Mr. Salles told me to write about, linking the form to the poet's ideas, because I know now, I've seen this many times in his video, poet's ideas are at the top of the mark scheme. So otter, much easier to remember. Now comes the even more liberating part of the new method. I no longer need to compare as I go, because I've seen so many top grade essays that don't do this. I've also seen loads that do. Yeah, so it's still a fantastic method, but it's harder. So here is the new, easier method. I've got a named poem in the exam paper and one that I'm choosing to compare. It turns out that the examiners don't care about two things. They don't care which one you write most about. So my old method said pretty much you wrote equally about each one because you kept swapping from one to the other. The examiners don't care about that. The other brilliant thing they don't care about is whether the one you write most about is the named poem, the one that's on the page. So you can go into the exam with kind of 4 poems prepared, knowing that they will fit any question that comes up. This means you can say to yourself psychologically, right, the minute I open that exam paper, I'm going to apply the poem that's in my head, the one that I've revised, to the question, and I'm going to write most about that one. I'm going to use the Mr. Salles OTTER technique, opening, one image technique, another image technique, the ending technique, all linked to the author's you know what. Then my reminder, have I written about form and structure when I wrote about those? If not, I'm going to write something now. It's only going to be a sentence long, maybe 2 at the most. And then I'm going to write another couple of sentences. So this other couple of sentences will do all my comparison to the next poem. It will say something like, and I'll use exposure and bayonet charge as an example, but this will work whichever poems you're doing. So I'll point out a similarity. Both poems are written about the horrors of war. In exposure, Owen is writing for an audience at home that he thinks has become indifferent to the suffering of their sons, brothers and husbands and are leaving them to die. Whereas in Bayonet Charge, Hughes is trying to evoke a horror of war more generally in his audience because this particular war has long passed. Consequently, both poets focus on vivid, savage, natural imagery. That was 3 sentences really, wasn't it? But that's it. Once I've done that, that's all my comparison. Will the examiners need more comparison? No, this is amazing. I hadn't really considered this properly until I started reading loads of answers. The exam boards, it doesn't matter which exam board you look at, are obsessed with the assessment objective, the AOs. And there is no assessment objective that says comparison. So the examiners don't really care about it. As long as you've framed your essay to say you're comparing, they'll tick that box and say, this essay must be comparing. So, let's backtrack. I've written about my favourite poem with OTTER. I've given my 2 or 3 sentences, like I dramatised to you, comparing the two. Remember how I did the author's purpose. I looked at the effect they wanted to have on the audience. What do I do next? I get my second poem, the one that's my least favourite, so either it's the one in your head or the one on the page, and I'm just going to otter it again. Is that a verb? It's a new verb from Mr. Salles, to otter. So I'm going to otter that new poem in exactly the same way, and then I've nearly finished. The last thing I need to do, I don't have to write on the board, because it's the last thing you do with every essay. Put your pen down and go home. No, you write a conclusion, don't you? So you just whap out your conclusion and then you are done. You're probably going to ask me, oh, how many paragraphs is that, sir? Because in your old method I could see that there was a paragraph about form, another one about the opening, another one about one image and technique, another about the other image technique, another one about the ending, and so that gave me 5 big chunky paragraphs, then a conclusion. How many paragraphs now? Well, the short answer is the examiners do not care. So if you wanted to, you could write about all of OTTER in one big fat paragraph if you wanted, and then you could write about the next poem in another big fat paragraph, so your answer would only have 2 paragraphs and a conclusion. I don't recommend that. I recommend that you have a paragraph for each of O, T, T, E and R, but the examiners don't care. I only care because that makes you a better writer. The more ideas you have in a paragraph, the less easy it is to understand. The final question that I always get asked is how many quotes. So hopefully you can see how many. 1, 2, 3, 4 for the first poem, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 for the second. And so that's 8 quotes, 4 from each poem. The video that will benefit you most now is to see a 30 out of 30 poetry comparison essay. And that is the video coming up now.